So moving on, we have a few slides regarding how internal controls impact audit strategy. Hopefully some of this is going to sound like review at this point. So we know the whole point of internal controls and evaluating internal controls is to make our control risk assessment. We also have this flowchart, which is actually really similar to the flowchart we looked at the other day in chapter 5. Right? So all this flowchart is doing is showing, okay, we evaluate internal controls to see if we think they're effective or not. If we think controls are not effective, we would want to set control risk at high or max, and we would want to go with the substantive strategy, which is what it's saying there, and we would need to perform more substantive testing. If we think controls are good, we want to rely on controls, then we can say control risk is low or perhaps moderate, and then we're going to be doing control testing first. And then based on that control testing, you'll see if you really obtain the level of control risk that you thought you had, because this is the results of your risk assessment, right? I do my initial risk assessment and I may come to a certain conclusion like AR controls are good, so control risk for AR is low. But then maybe when I actually test those controls, some of them fail, and so control risk for AR goes up. Okay? So I sort of have to reassess, which is what this step is talking about, to determine if I actually met that planned level of control risk. And then basically I adjust my detection risk from there, which is my level of substantive procedures that I need to perform. This slide also review at this point, but it's just here to remind you it's the same as this decision tree. And the other point in this that I want to remind you of is no matter how good a company's controls are, right, which is this end of the spectrum, perfect controls, you're still going to have to do some substantive work at the end of the day. But if controls are good, you will substantially reduce your substantive testing because you get to do that much as opposed to that much. These two slides summarize the substantive versus reliance strategy. So it's just reminding you, hey, if you're following the substantive strategy, that means control risk or CR is high. And to be clear, when we're talking about substantive or reliance strategy, it can be for the audit as a whole, but more likely than not, you're going to do this sort of on an account level, right? So I could feasibly for AR, for cash, follow a reliance approach, but then for AP, because I know AP controls suck, I'm going to follow the substantive approach. So you definitely don't have to follow, the same rule for everything. You can mix it up. So why would you do the substantive strategy? So far, we've really been focused on this as the reason why, so controls are ineffective, but it also could be because the controls are basically incomplete. So when we're testing controls, if we're comfortable with control risk being low, it's usually because we have identified at least one key control for every relevant assertion for an account. So for example, for AR, I would want to have at least one key control for existence, completeness, R&O, valuation, so on. So if they just had controls related to existence and they didn't have any of these, I wouldn't really feel comfortable going with a reliance approach for AR. You could decide for a particular account that testing the effectiveness of controls is simply inefficient. Think back to earlier when we were talking about the IT controls, right? So if a company has all systems and we're able to make sure we can rely upon those systems, and we're just doing tests of one of IT controls, that's really efficient. But if we find out their systems are unreliable and basically have to treat every control as if it's manual, done by hand, then testing controls gets incredibly inefficient. So if a company has unreliable systems or a lot of manual controls, so if their whole operation was on paper and they're not automated, then this could be another case in which testing controls is just very inefficient, and it would be better for us to go for a substantive strategy. For the reliance approach, this is when we're able to assess control risk lower, and of course you want to obtain an understanding of internal control, which this obtaining an understanding of internal control stuff should happen during the risk assessment process. And I mean the auditor's risk assessment process, not management's risk assessment process. And we will document our understanding of internal control in a variety of ways. So I've seen, and usually you'll just have one that you use for an audit. So I've seen audits where it's entirely flowcharts, and I've seen audits where it's entirely narratives. I didn't see too much of this in practice. I did see a little of this. This almost implies these things are coming from the company, right? So usually if we had something like that, we'd kind of include it as an addendum to a narrative. In terms of entity size and the impact of that on internal control, the 5 COSO components, you should be able to find them ideally in all entities, but in a small company, they're going to be a lot less formal. And part of the reason for this is a smaller company may not need as formal internal control, right? So part of the point of internal control and corporate governance is it helps to mitigate agency problems. And you're not going to have as many agency problems in a smaller company like a startup, right, with very few people, for all the reasons we talked about in chapter 1. Another reason why things are going to be less formal in a smaller company is you may simply not have enough physical bodies to be able to complete all the controls. So if you think about something like segregation of duties, let's say I have, for a particular thing like AP, I have 3 activities that I need to split up, but there's only 1 person or 2 people in my AP department. So how can I possibly split up my 3 activities? I can't. Right? So that's the other problem, and why there often can be internal control weaknesses, especially in smaller entities. It's like there physically aren't enough people to adequately segregate the various activities. All right, and the limitations of internal control. All right, so we do like internal control because it can help prevent fraud, it can help mitigate agency problems, but it is subject to limitations, of course. So we have this chart from the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, which shows a lot of the primary internal control weaknesses they saw in actual observed cases of fraud. So this isn't companies in general, these are companies where there were cases of fraud. You see things like, okay, the controls were overridden, or there just weren't any controls in the first place. But one of the things you'll often hear is, okay, even if you have the best possible system of internal control, if you have all your 5 COSO components and you have all 17 principles, you can still have management overriding internal control, you can still have people colluding, and then it's very difficult to stop that from happening. 1, right, even if you have the perfect system, and 2, it's also very difficult to actually detect it from an audit perspective. In terms of assessing control risk, and we're going to talk about this more in chapter 7, the first step is, hey, we're figuring out what controls we rely on. So this is your initial risk assessment. Then you actually do your TOC, and then you'll do your final risk assessment. And here, now you're knowing, okay, this is the actual achieved level of control risk, which will let you know exactly how much you need to do in terms of substantive work. And this is just, I won't force you to hear me read this out to you, but it's just examples of different types of test of controls. These next couple slides talk about timing of audit procedures and when you do things at interim versus year-end. So I want to quickly talk about that. Basically, if you're moving tests up to interim, it's because you think risk is relatively low. Usually it's because you think controls are pretty effective. And so you'll see there's actually this list on the next slide talking about factors that would influence you to perform interim TOC and interim substantive procedures. Right? And interim just means anything you're doing before year end. So if I'm doing procedures after the financial statement date, so anything over here, then those are considered year-end procedures. But anything that you are able to do before year-end, that's all part of your interim procedures. Okay. And in terms of this list, we had talked about, okay, so risk is a reason we would do this. And typically it's because RMM is low. That allows us to move work up, because we said it's always better to move work up, because we don't want to do work in January and February. We don't want to pile all our work in January and February and March, because that's busy season, right? So the less work we can do in January, February, March, the better. The more work we can do sooner today, the better, right? And so what lets me move work up is if RMM is low. It's also if I have a good control environment. So in other words, the CR is low. And a lot of times you know this because the control has been effective in prior audits. It could also be the account or particular assertion is not very significant or it's low risk, right? And so we talked about this idea that something like AR existence is considered very high risk because the main risk with AR is overstatement. But if you have something like AR completeness, that is relatively low risk because I'm not really worried that most companies are going to try to understate their AR. So maybe I can get my AR completeness tests out of the way early and I'll save my AR existence tests until year end. Another thing to consider is your ability to perform procedures to cover the remaining period. So let's talk about what that means. So in this case, it says I'm conducting substantive tests during this period here, right? So what that means is for any substantive testing I do during this period, I'm doing it as of November 30th for this particular firm. I mean, for a lot of my audits, we do it as of 9/30. I never saw anything earlier than 3 months before the balance sheet date, but it was pretty common to see it 3 months before. So if you're doing your procedures as of 11/30, let's talk about something like AR confirmations, right? AR confirmations is a good one to be able to do as of an interim date because it usually takes customers to a really long time to reply to you, right? So the sooner you can send out those confirmations, the better. A lot of times you have to send second requests and third requests. And so it's better for me to be able to send them a month early at 11/30, whereas if I have to wait till after year end to do that, then it's really a really crunched timeline before I have to issue my report. But if I do my testing as of 11/30, it's really helpful. It gives me a lot more time, allowance for that turnaround. But then what does that mean? It means because I'm actually giving my opinion, right, issuing my audit opinion on the balance sheet and on AR as of 12/31, right? So 12/31 is my opinion. So essentially what that means is I need to do some kind of roll forward procedures to cover any changes in AR during that 1 month period, right? So we said things like it's plus sales minus cash receipts. So generally what you would do here as an auditor, if you tested your AR confirmations as of 11/30, is you would then, if I need to render my opinion on AR as of 12/31, I would do testing over these populations, right, sales and cash receipts during December, and that would help me get comfortable with the changes in this account of AR during the month of December. And now, because I tested the 11/30 balance very rigorously with confirmations, which we know, right, it's a very reliable and relevant procedure for AR existence. And now I've also tested all my changes that happened during the month of December. Now I'm comfortable issuing my opinion on 12/31. But if I had an account where I wasn't able to perform appropriate procedures to cover that remaining period, so I'm going to write roll forward, because that's kind of what I was just doing on the last page. It was a roll forward. If you weren't able to do something like that, you would have to wait until year end to test the account. But you'll see us doing a lot of roll forward testing on things like AR, and you'll also see a lot of it on inventory observations. So I'll observe inventory as of 10/31 or something like that, and then I'll just do a roll forward to cover those 2 months. Final topic. So we have, when we're testing controls, we have a lot of companies that use these service organizations. And so the most common example that people might be familiar with would be ADP for payroll. Hopefully you guys are familiar with it. If you're not, go click on that link in your slides. So ADP does a lot of payroll services. So companies just outsource their payroll to ADP. They also do a lot of HR services. So a lot of companies use ADP to keep their HR records. When you have something like this, as the auditor, I want to test controls over payroll, right? I need to do my test of controls over payroll. So herein lies the problem. ADP is really the one that has the company's payroll controls, but ADP is also doing payroll for 10,000 other companies. Does it make sense for me, the auditor, to go over to ADP to try to test my client's payroll controls? Does it make sense for the auditors of the 10,000 other companies to go to ADP to try to test the payroll controls? No, we're not going to have 100,000 auditors, trying to descend on ADP headquarters to try to test their controls all at once, right? So instead, what ADP does is they issue a report. So we have these reports coming out of service organizations like ADP. Okay, and there's 2 types of reports. What we like and want to see is the type 2 report, because the type 2 report actually includes test of controls. So what we would do really is contact ADP as the auditor. We would contact ADP and we'd say, hey, can I see your type 2 report? And they should be able to send us back this type 2 report, which is going to include a full report on the ADP's control environment to help us understand their control environment. And it will also include an opinion from their auditor on the operating effectiveness of their test of controls. So if we get this type 2 report, it will allow us to assess our control risk below maximum. And assuming they have a good auditor, a reliable auditor, and we see that the auditor concluded, positively on their test of controls. I've seen many audits where we say, okay, control risk is low for payroll based on a type 2 report. If we see a type 1 report, we are sad, because all the type 1 report does is gives us an understanding of the control environment. It tells us nothing about test of controls or effectiveness of controls. So unfortunately, if all you get is a type 1 report, your control risk will still be high for that particular process. So most service providers, especially really popular service providers like ADP, do provide type 2 reports. If you have a smaller service provider that, hasn't been doing it very long and doesn't have very many clients, they might do the type 1 report, because obviously it's a lot cheaper for them to get a type 1 report, but then they might start to realize their clients aren't very happy because then their auditors aren't very happy. All right, and that's all we have for chapter 6. So hopefully you're still awake and you will tune in next time for chapter 7.